It was a quiet Monday morning in downtown Atlanta, the kind of morning when the city hadn't fully woken up yet. The streets were still stretching from the weekend silence, and the first rays of sunlight slid across the glass windows of tall buildings. Judge Ronald Harris sat in his car listening to the faint hum of the radio. He liked starting his day in calmness before stepping into the courthouse where long hours of serious cases awaited him. He was known for his calm nature, for the way he spoke softly yet firmly in his courtroom. Years of experience had taught him that anger never fixed anything, and that respect often went further than authority. This morning he was running a few minutes behind schedule. He took a slow sip from his travel mug, then turned into the courthouse parking entrance, nodding to the security guard at the gate. But just before his car reached the checkpoint, a white police officer standing near the entrance raised his hand, signaling him to stop. The officer was young, probably in his late 20s, with a serious face and a firm stance. He wore his uniform neatly, his badge catching a bit of the morning sun. The judge rolled down his window halfway, slightly puzzled. The officer walked closer, his hand resting near his belt. "Good morning, sir," the officer said in a tone that was polite but tense. "Can I see some identification?" The judge blinked, surprised by the sudden request. "Of course," he said calmly, reaching for his wallet. "May I ask what this is about?" "There was a report about someone matching your description," the officer replied, "driving around the area in a dark car, possibly carrying something suspicious." The judge paused, his eyebrows lifting slightly. He handed over his ID without argument. "I see," he said softly. "Well, this is my courthouse. I'm due in court in about 15 minutes. The officer glanced at the ID, frowning slightly as if not sure what to make of it. "I'll need to verify this," he said. "Can you step out of the vehicle, please?" There was a moment of silence between them. A couple of pedestrians passed by, looking curiously toward the stopped car. The judge let out a quiet breath and slowly opened his door. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. Years on the bench had taught him that keeping calm in tense moments could turn storms into quiet air. He stepped out, standing tall and dignified. He wasn't an intimidating man, but there was something steady about the way he carried himself. "Officer," he said gently, "I assure you there's been a mistake." The young man gave a brief nod but didn't lower his guard. He looked at the ID again and then back at the judge. "This says you're a judge," he said, skeptical. "But anyone can say that." The judge didn't take offense. He knew that the world was full of misunderstandings, sometimes innocent, sometimes not. Still, there was something unsettling about standing there, being questioned in front of the very building where he had served justice for over a decade. As minutes passed, more people began arriving at the courthouse. Some slowed down to see what was happening. A courthouse clerk walking toward the entrance noticed the scene and stopped mid-step. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Judge Harris?" she called out, sounding surprised. "Is everything all right?" The officer's head turned sharply toward her, then back to the man standing before him. His posture stiffened. "You're Judge Harris?" he asked quietly. "Yes," the judge replied evenly. "I preside here. Courtroom 3. The officer's face turned slightly pale. His confidence wavered, but his pride stopped him from immediately admitting his mistake. "I just needed to confirm," he said quickly. "We've had reports this morning and I can't take chances." The judge nodded slowly. "I understand. You're doing your job." His tone remained steady, though inside a quiet disappointment began to grow. Not anger, just the heavy realization of how easily someone's appearance could change the way they're treated. By now, 2 more officers had noticed the situation from across the street and started walking over. The young officer waved them off, embarrassed. The courthouse clerk approached and whispered to him, confirming the judge's identity. The air around them shifted slightly, from suspicion to awkward silence. The officer handed back the ID quickly. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir," he said, avoiding eye contact. The judge took his ID, offering a small nod. "No harm done," he said, though his tone carried the weight of unspoken words. He looked at the young man for a brief moment as if studying him, not with judgment but curiosity. Then he turned back toward his car. Before he opened the door, he said quietly, "You know, officer, the courthouse has its fair share of lessons. Maybe you'll find one waiting inside someday." The officer said nothing, simply stepped back as the judge drove through the gate. Inside the courthouse parking lot, The judge parked his car and sat for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. He wasn't thinking about the case waiting for him or the files in his briefcase. He was thinking about how easily dignity could be questioned, how assumptions could erase years of hard work in an instant. He sighed, closed his eyes briefly, then gathered his things and stepped out. As he walked through the courthouse doors, everyone greeted him respectfully. The same building, the same people, but now the morning felt a little heavier. He made his way to his chambers, where his assistant was already sorting through documents. She looked up with a smile. "Good morning, Judge. You ready for today's case?" He smiled faintly. "As ready as ever," he said. Though the morning had a bit of a surprise. "What happened?" she asked. He shook his head gently. "Nothing worth discussing right now, but maybe something worth learning from later." He hung his coat, placed his briefcase on the desk, and took a deep breath. The gavel sitting neatly on his desk reminded him of what he stood for: fairness, balance, and patience. He'd seen countless people lose control in courtrooms, people who reacted in anger and regret. And here he was, realizing how easily he could have done the same outside those courtroom walls. As the morning went on, he conducted his cases as usual, calm, collected, respectful. But between moments of silence, his mind returned to that parking lot. To the way the officer's eyes had changed once he realized who he was, to the way people stared, curious but not surprised. It wasn't the first time he had faced such a moment, but it was the first time it happened right outside his place of work, the one place where justice was supposed to see beyond color or status. Later that day, during a short break, one of the senior clerks came to see him. "Judge, I heard about what happened this morning," she said softly. "People are talking about it. Are you going to file a complaint?" He looked up from his papers, his expression calm. "No," he said. "I don't think he meant harm. He just didn't know better. But still," she said gently, "you shouldn't have been treated like that." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes it's not about how you're treated. It's about how you respond." The clerk nodded quietly, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. As the day ended, the judge walked out of the courthouse, the sun now lower in the sky. The same officer was standing near the gate, looking uncomfortable as their eyes met. For a moment, neither said anything. Then the judge walked up to him and extended his hand. "You had a busy morning," the judge said softly. The officer hesitated, then shook his hand. "I'm really sorry, sir. I should have looked closer before making assumptions." The judge nodded. "It happens," he said kindly. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do with them afterward." The officer looked down, visibly relieved but thoughtful. "Thank you for understanding, sir." The judge smiled, his eyes warm but steady. "Take care of yourself, officer. Every morning brings a chance to see things differently." As he walked away, the officer stood still, watching him disappear through the crowd. Something about that encounter stayed with him. Not the embarrassment, but the quiet grace with which the man had handled it. That night, as the judge sat at home reading his notes, he thought again about the young officer. He could have filed a report, could have turned it into a public issue, but instead, he saw something more valuable, a moment that could teach more than punishment ever would. He didn't know yet that this small incident would soon spread beyond the courthouse, that it would turn into a story people would share, not about anger or blame, but about patience, respect, and quiet strength. For now, he simply closed his eyes, letting the noise of the day fade. The city outside buzzed softly, unaware that an ordinary morning had just planted the seed of an extraordinary lesson. The next morning came quietly, with sunlight spilling through the tall courthouse windows. The air felt normal again, yet something lingered in the halls. A quiet buzz of talk that moved softly from one person to another. Everyone had heard about what happened outside the courthouse gate the day before. No one spoke of it directly to the judge, but their glances carried questions. Judge Harris noticed it too. People's looks weren't judgmental, just curious. The kind of look that said, "We can't believe that happened to you." But he carried himself the same way he always did, calm and dignified, as if nothing unusual had taken place. That morning he greeted the staff as he entered the courtroom, his briefcase in one hand and his calm smile in place. But deep inside, the memory of that parking lot moment still echoed. The voice of that young officer, the disbelief in his eyes, the hesitation in his tone. It all replayed in the back of his mind. The judge wasn't angry, but he couldn't ignore the quiet ache of how easily someone could look at him and see anything but what he truly was. Across town, the same officer, Officer Miller, sat at his desk, unable to stop thinking about what he had done. He'd spent most of the night replaying the scene in his mind, feeling that twist of embarrassment each time he pictured the judge's calm face. His pride told him it was just a misunderstanding, that he was only doing his job. But his conscience whispered something deeper, that maybe he had seen what he wanted to see, not what was actually in front of him. At the station, some of the senior officers had already heard about it. A few of them laughed it off, saying, "Well, that's one way to start your new post," while others shook their heads and told him to be more careful next time. But the words that stayed with him were from the sergeant, a quiet older man who had seen it all. "You're lucky he was who he was," the sergeant said, tapping his finger on the desk. "Another man might have handled that very differently." Miller nodded, keeping his eyes down. "I know," he said softly. "Then make sure you remember that," the sergeant added. "Respect isn't just for the badge. It's for the people behind it, no matter who they are." Those words kept circling in Miller's head all morning. Back at the courthouse, Judge Harris sat through case after case, listening carefully to each side as always. But even as he listened to lawyers argue, a part of him was thinking about that officer. He had seen countless cases of conflict between citizens and law enforcement, each story more complicated than the last. But he had never imagined being on the other side of one, even briefly. When court adjourned for lunch, he went to his chambers to rest. His assistant knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. "Judge," she said gently, "the chief clerk mentioned that Officer Miller stopped by the courthouse this morning." The judge looked up, surprised. "He did?" "Yes, he asked if he could speak with you sometime this week, if you'd be open to it." The judge didn't answer right away. He leaned back slightly, thinking. "He wants to talk?" "That's what he said." He seemed nervous but respectful. After a short pause, the judge nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Tell him to come by tomorrow morning, before the session starts." The next day, the same young officer stood outside the judge's office, his hat in his hands, his face showing both nervousness and regret. The secretary led him in, and when he saw the judge behind his desk, he straightened his posture and took a deep breath. "Good morning, sir," he said respectfully. The judge smiled faintly. "Good morning, Officer Miller. Have a seat." Miller sat down carefully, his back straight, his hands clasped tightly together. "Sir," he began, "I wanted to come here to apologize. What I did yesterday, I know it was wrong. I misjudged you and I let my assumptions guide my actions. I'm truly sorry." The judge studied him quietly. His tone was sincere and nervous but genuine. "I appreciate that," the judge said after a pause. "But tell me, why did you think I was suspicious that morning?" Miller hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the floor. "I don't really have a good answer," he said honestly. I saw someone who matched a vague description, and I didn't think twice. I acted before I really looked. I thought I was doing my duty." The judge nodded slowly. "Duty is important, but so is judgment, the kind that goes beyond what our eyes see." Miller nodded. "I understand that now. I should have treated you with more respect, regardless of what I assumed." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Respect shouldn't depend on who someone is. It should come naturally, especially from those who wear the uniform of service." There was no anger in his tone, just truth. Miller listened closely, absorbing every word. After a few moments of silence, the judge said softly, "Officer, I'm not angry at you, but I believe moments like these can teach more than punishment ever could. I plan to hold an open session next week, a discussion about bias and perception in public service. I'd like you to be there." Miller blinked in surprise. "You want me to attend?" "Yes," the judge replied. "Not as an example, but as a participant. I believe people learn better when they speak from experience." The young officer nodded slowly. "If it'll help others, I'll be there." "I owe that much," the judge smiled faintly. "Good, then we'll call it even." When Miller left the office, his steps felt lighter, not because he had escaped blame, but because he had been given something much more meaningful, a chance to understand. That evening, as he drove home, he thought about the conversation again. It wasn't just about the embarrassment of being wrong. It was about realizing how small actions born from habits or fears could leave deep marks on others. He thought about how calm the judge had been that morning, even when he had every reason to be upset. That kind of patience wasn't weakness, it was strength. Meanwhile, the judge stayed late in his chambers, reviewing files by the soft glow of his desk lamp. But his mind wasn't on the paperwork. He was thinking about how often people spoke of justice inside the courtroom, but forgot it existed outside those walls too. He had seen people argue about fairness their entire lives, yet fairness often began with something simple: how you chose to see another person. The next morning, courthouse chatter was louder than usual. Word had spread that the judge would be holding a public discussion next week on perception and justice. Everyone was curious. Some thought it was about the recent courthouse stop. Others believed it was part of a new outreach effort. When Officer Miller arrived that morning to deliver a report, the older sergeant approached him with a raised brow. "Heard you're going to be part of that discussion," the sergeant said. "Yes, sir," Miller replied. "Well," the sergeant said, tapping his notebook. "Good. Maybe others can learn from what happened. Takes guts to show up after that." Miller gave a small nod. "It's the least I can do." Throughout that week, the courthouse halls seemed to buzz with anticipation. Everyone respected Judge Harris for his fairness, but this was something different. Personal. Some staff wondered if he was angry deep down, but those who knew him best said he wasn't that kind of man. On Friday afternoon, the judge stood by the tall courthouse windows, looking out at the parking lot where everything had started. The scene looked ordinary again. Cars coming and going, people walking with purpose. Yet to him it carried a deeper meaning now. That simple stop had become something bigger, something that could change how people thought, even if just a little. His assistant walked in quietly and placed a folder on his desk. "These are the notes for next week's discussion," she said. He smiled at her. "Thank you. I think this might be one of the most important sessions we've ever had." She nodded, then hesitated. "Judge," she said softly, "you could have filed a complaint or at least made it official. Why didn't you?" He looked out the window again. "Because sometimes the best justice isn't written in reports," he said gently. "It's found in the moments that make people stop and think." That weekend, Miller sat at his kitchen table, flipping through his small notepad. He wrote down a few thoughts about the experience, about how quick assumptions could harm trust, and how one calm conversation could change perspective more than punishment ever could. He didn't realize it yet, but that upcoming session at the courthouse would not only change the way others saw him, it would change the way he saw himself. And far beyond the courthouse walls, this quiet story was already beginning to stir, preparing to remind people everywhere that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the moments that test our understanding of each other. The day of the open session arrived. The courthouse was busier than usual, and there was a different kind of energy in the air. People weren't rushing through the halls the way they normally did. Instead, they were talking quietly in small groups, curious about what Judge Harris was planning to say. It wasn't often that a sitting judge held an open session like this. Some thought it was about community awareness. Others thought it was about the recent courthouse incident, though no one spoke of it out loud. Inside the courtroom, the benches filled up faster than usual. Lawyers, clerks, police officers, law students, and even a few journalists sat waiting. The room buzzed with quiet chatter until the side door opened and Judge Harris stepped in, wearing his black robe. The moment he entered, the room fell silent. He took his seat, adjusting his glasses, his expression calm but thoughtful. He didn't open any files or bang the gavel. He simply looked around the courtroom for a few seconds, taking in the faces before him. Then, with a quiet voice that carried through the room, he said, "Today we won't be talking about any case. We'll be talking about something that shapes every case before it even begins: how we see one another." His words hung in the air for a moment. Everyone listened. He continued, "A few days ago, something happened outside this very courthouse. Some of you might have heard about it. A misunderstanding took place between myself and a young officer. It wasn't violent, it wasn't loud, but it was meaningful, because it reminded me that assumptions can build walls faster than laws can tear them down." There was a soft murmur in the room, people exchanging glances. Officer Miller sat near the back, his hands clasped tightly on his lap. He hadn't wanted to sit in the front. He didn't want attention, but the judge had personally invited him, so he came. Judge Harris went on. We often speak of justice as something that happens inside this room. But real justice begins long before anyone steps through those doors. It starts in the mind and how we choose to see people. Every uniform, every badge, every title, every robe, they all mean something. But underneath them, we are still people, shaped by what we've seen and what we've been taught to believe. He paused, letting his words settle. Then he said, Before I share my thoughts, I want to hear from someone who was part of that moment. Officer Miller, would you please come forward? All eyes turned toward the young officer. He hesitated for a second, then stood up slowly, his face pale but determined. As he walked to the front, the room stayed silent. He stood beside the judge's bench, looking uncertain. Don't worry, the judge said softly. This isn't a trial. It's a conversation. Miller nodded, taking a breath. Thank you, Your Honor. The judge smiled slightly. Tell us, officer, in your own words, what went through your mind that morning? Miller looked down for a moment, then back up at the crowd. His voice was quiet but steady. Honestly, sir, I thought I was doing my job. We'd received a vague report that morning about a man near the courthouse carrying something suspicious. I saw someone who fit the description and acted without really thinking. But, he hesitated, his throat tightening. The truth is, I didn't just see a man. I saw what I thought that man could be. I didn't stop to think who he might actually be. The room was still. His honesty caught people off guard. He continued, When I realized who you were, sir, I felt embarrassed. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, but it wasn't just that. It was more than that. I judged you before I even knew you. I made a decision in seconds that had nothing to do with facts, only assumptions, and I regret it deeply. A few people in the room nodded quietly. Others looked down, thoughtful. Judge Harris nodded slowly, his expression calm. Thank you for your honesty, officer. That takes courage. He looked back at the room and said, You see, this is what I wanted us to understand. Most people don't mean harm when they make assumptions, but assumptions, even small ones, can build invisible walls. Those walls separate us, limit us, and change the way we treat each other, even when we don't notice it. He leaned forward slightly, his tone warm but serious. When that officer stopped me, I saw a young man doing his job, trying to be careful. But I also saw fear and uncertainty, not toward me as a person, but toward the picture in his mind. And I understood something that morning. Real change doesn't come from blame. It comes from awareness. He turned back to Miller. Officer, tell me, what do you think could help prevent moments like this from happening again? Miller thought for a moment, then said, I think more understanding. More time spent outside of the badge, outside of the courtroom. When people only see each other in uniform, they forget the person underneath. Maybe if more of us, officers, judges, and citizens, actually talk to each other, we'd realize how much we have in common. The judge smiled gently. That's a wise answer. He stood and walked from behind the bench, standing beside the officer. When I was younger, he said, I was stopped once too, long before I became a judge. It was late at night and I was walking home from my law classes. I remember the flashlight in my face, the sharp questions, and the doubt in the officer's eyes. I remember thinking how quickly the respect I earned in school disappeared on that dark street. I told myself that day that if I ever had power to change something, I would do it not through anger but through example. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words filled the room. People listened closely, not wanting to miss a single sentence. He continued, The young officer that night didn't remember me, but I remembered him. And now, years later, when I saw Officer Miller's face, I remembered that same look, the look of a man trying to do right, but blinded by the shadows of what he's been taught to fear. Miller looked down, guilt written across his face. The judge placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, Don't carry shame, son. Carry understanding. Shame closes the mind. Understanding opens it. The room fell silent again. It wasn't a heavy silence, and it was thoughtful, almost peaceful. The kind of silence that made people reflect on their own moments of judgment. After a long pause, the judge said, I hope that from today forward, everyone in this room remembers this. Titles don't make us better than anyone else. The robe doesn't make me wiser. The badge doesn't make you stronger. What makes us better is how we treat those who have no titles at all. The words drew quiet nods from the audience. Even some of the officers sitting in the back shifted uncomfortably. realizing how often they too might have judged before understanding. The judge returned to his seat. "That will be all for today," he said quietly. "But before we leave, I want everyone here to think of one person they may have misjudged in their life. Maybe a stranger, maybe someone close to you. Think about what might have changed if you had just stopped to listen first." No one moved for a moment. Then slowly, people began to stand and file out of the room. The sound of footsteps echoed softly, mixed with quiet conversations about what they had just heard. Miller stayed behind, unsure if he should leave or say something more. The judge noticed and walked over. "You did well today," he said kindly. "I just told the truth," Miller said, his voice low. "That's more than most people are willing to do," the judge replied. "Keep doing that, and you'll serve justice better than any badge ever could." Miller nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, sir, for not judging me back," the judge smiled. "I only gave you what I hope others will give me. A fair chance." As Miller left the courtroom, sunlight filtered through the high windows, lighting the old wooden benches. The judge stood there for a moment, watching the door close behind him. He felt a quiet sense of peace, not because he had made a speech, but because maybe, just maybe, he had changed one person's way of seeing the world. Later that afternoon, as the courthouse emptied, a few young law students approached him in the hallway. One of them said softly, "Your Honor, thank you for today. I've never seen a judge speak like that before." He smiled gently. "The law may tell us what's right, but kindness reminds us how to live it," he said. When he finally left for the day, the parking lot looked just as it had that morning. Cars moved in and out, people talked and laughed, unaware of how one quiet courtroom conversation might ripple through the city in ways none of them could yet see. That night, in homes across town, people who had attended the session told the story of a judge, an officer, and a simple misunderstanding that became something more. They didn't talk about it as a scandal or a controversy, but as a story of humility and grace. And in the heart of the city, both the judge and the officer slept a little lighter, connected by a lesson that neither of them would ever forget. The courtroom was full that morning. People had heard what had happened at the courthouse gate, and curiosity filled every seat. Lawyers, police officers, law students, even clerks all came to see what Judge Harris was about to say. Some expected anger. Others thought he might humiliate the young officer in front of everyone, but no one really knew what was coming. Officer Miller sat in the front row, his uniform crisp, his hat resting on his lap. He looked nervous, like a man waiting for a verdict he already feared. The judge walked in quietly, his face calm as always. Everyone stood, then sat down when he signaled. There was no case to argue that day, only a lesson to be shared. Judge Harris began speaking softly. His tone was steady, his words measured. "What happened outside this courthouse," he said, "was not an act of hatred. It was an act of assumption. And assumptions can be just as dangerous as anger." He paused and looked toward Officer Miller, not with hostility but with a strange kind of calm. "We all carry stories in our heads," he continued. "Stories about what people look like, how they act, what they might do. Sometimes those stories help us. Sometimes they blind us." The room was silent. Even the air felt still. Miller's eyes stayed down, but he listened closely. The judge turned toward the audience and said, "I invited Officer Miller here today because we can only grow when we face what's uncomfortable. I don't want to punish him. I want him to tell us what he saw that morning, what he felt, and what made him act the way he did." Miller's throat tightened. He didn't want to speak, but the judge's voice was calm, almost reassuring. Slowly, he stood up. "Your Honor," he began, "when I stopped you that day, I thought I was doing my job. I got a call about a man near the courthouse who matched a description. When I saw you, I acted fast, maybe too fast. I didn't stop to think. I just reacted." He looked around, seeing the eyes of the crowd fixed on him. "I didn't know who you were," he said quietly. "But if I'm honest, I probably wouldn't have questioned someone who didn't look like you. I didn't realize that until later. I thought I was just being careful, but now I can see there was something else there, something I didn't want to admit." His voice cracked a little. "It wasn't hate," he said quickly, "but it was a kind of fear. Fear of getting it wrong, fear of being blamed, and I think that fear made me blind to respect." Judge Harris nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. "It takes courage to admit that. You see, fear can disguise itself as duty, and when that happens, justice becomes harder to see." He walked closer to the front of the courtroom, hands folded behind his back. "Many years ago," he said, "I was in your position, Officer Miller. I was a young man walking home from school, wearing a backpack full of law books. A patrol car stopped beside me. 2 officers asked me what I was carrying. They didn't ask with kindness. I was scared, but I stayed calm. That night I promised myself that if I ever had authority, I'd use it to build understanding, not walls." His voice grew softer. "Authority should never silence people. It should make space for truth." The crowd listened, every word sinking deep. The judge turned toward Miller again. "When you wear that uniform," he said gently, "you represent more than yourself. You carry the promise that everyone will be treated fairly, no matter what they look like or where they come from. That promise is sacred, but it's also heavy." Miller nodded, his eyes wet. "I understand that now, sir," he said. The judge smiled faintly. "Then this was not a mistake," he replied. "It was a lesson for both of us and for everyone watching." He looked at the audience again. "Let's not pretend that bias only lives in others. We all have it, every one of us. The challenge is not to deny it, but to confront it, to pause before we speak, to think before we judge, and to listen before we decide." The room stayed silent. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to fade away. Then, in a surprising move, Judge Harris invited members of the audience to share their thoughts. One young law student stood up. She said, "Your Honor, I've studied hundreds of cases about justice, but I've never seen it taught this way. It feels different when it's real, when it's human." Another person, a senior officer, spoke next. "Judge," he said respectfully, "I've served for 30 years, and I've seen good officers make bad decisions because of pride. What you did today might help change that." Miller sat quietly, listening, absorbing every word. He had never imagined that the man he stopped would treat him with kindness instead of resentment. In his mind, that moment replayed over and over, the flashing lights, the confusion, the embarrassment. But now it all looked different. It wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a moment that showed him who he really was and who he could still become. After the discussion, the judge dismissed the room. People left with thoughtful faces, whispering softly as they walked out. Miller stayed behind, hesitating near the door. Finally, he approached the bench where the judge was gathering his notes. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I wanted to say thank you. You didn't have to handle it this way. You could have reported me or worse, but you turned it into something I'll never forget." The judge looked at him kindly. "Gratitude is good," he said, "but what matters more is what you do with what you've learned. Carry it with you. Let it shape how you treat others." Miller nodded. "I will," he promised, "and I'll start by teaching others what you taught me today." The judge smiled and extended his hand. Miller shook it firmly, this time looking him directly in the eyes. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a bridge between two worlds that rarely meet with understanding. When Miller left the courtroom, the sunlight hit his face. He felt lighter somehow, but also more aware. Every person he passed on the street seemed a little more human than before. He realized how easy it was to misjudge someone in seconds and how powerful it was to take those seconds to understand instead. Back inside, Judge Harris sat alone for a moment. He looked out the window at the busy courthouse courtyard. People came and went, some rushing, some laughing, some tired from the day. To him, they all carried stories worth listening to. He knew that change didn't come from anger or lectures. It came from empathy. Later that afternoon, the courthouse clerk entered and said, "Judge, that was one of the most powerful sessions I've ever seen." "People are still talking about it." Harris smiled faintly. "Good," he said. "Let them talk. Change begins with conversation." That evening, Miller sat in his car outside the station thinking about the day. He opened his notebook and wrote down a few words. Listen first. Respect always. Learn forever. He didn't know if anyone else would ever read them, but he wanted to remember. The next morning, he requested to join the department's community training program, the one that helped new recruits understand bias, communication, and cultural awareness. The captain was surprised but approved it. Miller didn't mention what had happened at the courthouse. He didn't need to. His actions spoke for him. Weeks passed and word of the judge's session spread through the city. Some saw it as an example of patience and wisdom. Others saw it as a call for deeper change. But for those who had been in that courtroom, it was something else. It was a reminder that decency still existed, even in tense moments. The two men, one wearing the robe of justice, the other the badge of protection, had shown that humility could do what laws alone could not. It could open eyes, soften hearts, and remind people that respect was not earned through fear, but through understanding. Every time Officer Miller walked past the courthouse after that day, he felt something inside him settle. It wasn't guilt anymore, it was gratitude. And every time Judge Harris saw him from his window, he would nod quietly, knowing that a single uncomfortable encounter had become a turning point, not just for two men, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The city kept moving. Life went on, but something had shifted, something small yet lasting. And that, the judge thought, was how real change begins. One honest moment, one open heart, one unexpected conversation at a time. A few weeks had passed since that day in the courtroom, but people were still talking about it. The story had spread quietly at first, just whispers among courthouse workers and officers who had been there. Then local reporters picked it up, describing it as a moment of unexpected grace. It wasn't about scandal or blame. It was about understanding, something people didn't see enough of these days. Judge Harris never sought attention. He didn't give interviews or pose for pictures. To him, what happened was just a lesson, one that everyone could learn from, including himself. But no matter how much he tried to move on, the event had changed something around him. The courthouse felt different. People smiled more, greeted each other with a little more patience. Even the officers at the security gate seemed a bit softer in their tone. One morning, as the judge walked through the courthouse lobby, a clerk stopped him. "Your Honor," she said gently, "there's a young man waiting to see you. Says he just wants to thank you in person." When Harris looked over, he saw Officer Miller standing near the benches, holding a folder under his arm. He looked different, more relaxed, more sure of himself. As the judge approached, Miller stood straight and smiled. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said warmly. "Good morning," the judge replied with a nod. "What brings you here today?" Miller took a deep breath. "I wanted to tell you what's been happening since that day," he said. "I joined the community training program. I've been talking to young recruits about what happened between us. I tell them how easy it is to make assumptions, and how dangerous it can be if we don't stop to think." The judge smiled faintly. "That's good to hear," he said. "And how's it going?" "Better than I expected," Miller said. "Some of them listen, some don't, but at least they hear the story." "It's making them think twice," Harris nodded approvingly. "That's how change works," he said quietly. "Slow, steady, but real." They stood there for a moment in silence, both thinking about how far they'd come from that morning at the courthouse gate. The misunderstanding that had once felt like a wound had become a bridge, one neither of them had expected. A week later, the police department invited the judge to speak at a community forum. It was part of a new outreach effort that brought together officers, local leaders, and residents to discuss trust and accountability. Harris hesitated at first. He wasn't interested in fame, but eventually he agreed. The event took place in a large auditorium at a local university. The seats were packed with students, police cadets, journalists, and neighborhood residents. When the judge walked in, there was a quiet respect in the room. He didn't wear his robe that day, just a simple suit. He wanted to look like everyone else. Miller introduced him, briefly recounting what had happened that morning at the courthouse. "I made a mistake," he said openly, his voice clear. "But instead of anger, I was met with patience. And that patience changed my life." Then he stepped aside, letting the judge speak. Harris walked to the podium and looked at the crowd. "We all have a story," he began. "Some are easy to tell, others are harder. Mine is about a moment when two people met under tense circumstances and chose to listen instead of fight." He spoke slowly, without notes, from the heart. "We talk a lot about justice," he said, "but real justice begins with respect. Not just respect for the law, but for each other. Every person you meet is carrying a world you don't see. If you forget that, you forget what it means to be human."